I should mention that Paul Bathes left this world fairly recently, in 2016. So hopefully, now that you're clear on who is most likely to be identified as the father of developmental psychology, let's add to and refine that discussion to focus specifically on the type of developmental psychology you're enrolled in, that is, the lifespan approach, lifespan psychology, or lifespan development. And that individual, as you can see on this slide, would be Paul Bathes. So on this slide, we will note that particular construct and move on to the developmental principles that he emphasized in his particular theory, laying the groundwork for some, and we'll expand on these in Module 2, but let's take off. We're going to start by examining three basic issues in developmental psychology. The first is development in its nature continuous or discontinuous? Continuous implies that there's no substantial difference from, let's say, day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. Discontinuous, on the other hand, suggests that there are distinct differences. With a theory that lists stages, such as the Kohlberg theory of development of morality, Piaget's theory perhaps, Erikson's theory, we'll be discussing all those in this particular chapter. They all have stages. Would that imply continuous or discontinuous development? If you said discontinuous, you are right. So perhaps you're hoping for a definitive answer in terms of the continuity or discontinuity theme. Well, it rather depends. If you're a stage theorist, such as Erikson, Kohlberg, Piaget, you would definitely think in terms of discontinuous development. In upcoming slides, we'll look at theorists that have no stages, and they would be a member of the continuous perspective. So let's continue to add on to our basic issues of development. Next, active versus passive. Passive, shown on the left, children just being acted upon. Are they being acted on internally by their genetics, externally by environmental forces such as immediate environment or family or culture? Or on the right, are children actively engaging in their environment, choosing particular stimulus one over another, pursuing one path or another, maybe impacting external forces? Certainly those forces will act upon them, but is it two-way? So this child, what are her interests? What will she pick? Will her choices influence future directions, such as maybe a major in college or a career? Let's now consider an approach which could be called the psychodynamic, or if you prefer, the psychoanalytic perspective. Theorist? Well, it'd be the gentleman in the bottom right. Do you recognize Sigmund Freud? I assume it's an easy to spell name since he's on our list. So I would ask my students to free associate a little bit about Sigmund Freud if I was teaching face-to-face, and ask for what sort of images or terms come to mind. You'll excuse me, but I must pause. So if you're blanking, do you know any terms related to the mind? A set of three terms: id, ego, superego. How about any complexes, like Oedipus or Electra? Have you ever made a Freudian slip? So these would be some of the many terms associated with Freud. What about his emphasis? Well, sexuality and also aggression in terms of human nature. But if I ask you his focus, his main idea, definitely go with the unconsciousness or unconscious mind. So I left a few letters blank for you as an easy review to see how your spelling is going. Let's now consider an approach which could be called the psychodynamic, or if you prefer, the psychoanalytic perspective. Theorist? Well, it'd be the gentleman in the bottom right. Do you recognize Sigmund Freud? I assume it's an easy to spell name since he's on our list. So I would ask my students to free associate a little bit about Sigmund Freud if I was teaching face-to-face, and ask for what sort of images or terms come to mind. You'll excuse me, but I must pause. So if you're blanking, do you know any terms related to the mind? A set of 3 terms. Id, ego, superego. How about any complexes, like Oedipus or Electra? Have you ever made a Freudian slip? So these would be some of the many terms associated with Freud. What about his emphasis? Well, sexuality and also aggression in terms of human nature. But if I ask you his focus, his main idea, definitely go with the unconsciousness or unconscious mind. So I left a few letters blank for you as an easy review to see how your spelling is going. So if you're blanking, do you know any terms related to the mind? A set of 3 terms. Id, ego, superego. How about any complexes, like Oedipus or Electra? Have you ever made a Freudian slip? So these would be some of the many terms associated with Freud. What about his emphasis? Well, sexuality and also aggression in terms of human nature. But if I ask you his focus, his main idea, definitely go with the unconsciousness or unconscious mind. So I left a few letters blank for you as an easy review to see how your spelling is going. So let's consider the psychodynamic perspective, sometimes called psychoanalytic, same thing. Its founder, shown in the center and on the right. Of course, the great but controversial Sigmund Freud. We'll also consider on future slides his student which most applies to our course, one of the individuals who is proposed by some individuals to be the father of our discipline. But anyway, let's consider the theorist, of course, Sigmund Freud. Consider your memories of intro psych and what sort of concepts did you learn associated with Freud, not just limited to that focus one. Take a moment and think about it, if you will. Let's now consider 3 very Freudian constructs: the id, the superego, and the ego. Let's go to the next page to actually see the content we must associate with them. Now let's continue with Freud and consider the topic of the defense mechanisms. These are irrational tactics used by the ego. A healthy ego will be rational much of the time. An unhealthy ego, too stressed, might resort to these irrational strategies. Let's consider this list. There are a few more, but we'll confine ourselves to this list. Let's start with regression. Perhaps you know what the word regression means. It means basically the same in this circumstance too. To regress is to go back. So in this one, the ego has the person go back and act like they did at an earlier developmental stage. In this point in the class, I asked for examples if people have seen regression in their children, their nieces, nephews, their siblings. Examples might be a child that has stopped thumb sucking is now sucking their thumb again. A child that has stopped bedwetting is now bedwetting again, and so on. If you see a child doing regressive behaviors, you've got to ask what's going on that's so stressful in the child's life. It might be obvious. Maybe that child is experiencing daycare for the first time. Maybe the parents have split up. Maybe a parent has been deployed, and so on. But regression is to go back to an earlier and safer developmental stage. Let's consider repression next. Repression is when a threat It could be a threatening idea, memory, emotion. But when a threat is pushed deep down into the unconscious mind, remember the Freudian emphasis on the unconscious mind, it might slip out sometimes, maybe a Freudian slip, maybe in dreams, maybe in mental illness. But Freud believes that much has been repressed into the unconsciousness. Maybe you've heard of repressed memories of childhood abuse. They most positively do occur. Next, we'll consider reaction formation, the most fun one to talk about. In reaction formation, one emotion is turned into an opposite. So, for example, let's turn to two movies, Shrek and Star Trek. Consider Shrek first. Can you think of any characters who seem to turn one emotion they had into a very different one? When you're done with that, move on to the example of Star Wars, and again, any characters that have changed their emotions into a very different one. Get your examples, and then we'll see how well you did. Let's start with the movie Shrek. Can you think of the characters that had a strong emotion that was masking a strong opposite emotion? Shrek and Fiona would be a grand example. Acts like he actively dislikes her, but by the end of the movie, things have changed. And fortunately, Fiona had a similar reaction to Shrek. Shrek and the donkey. Shrek acts like he dislikes Donkey, but he risks his life to save Donkey when the dragon is trying to flame him. Even the dragon in Donkey, she's trying to flame him, and yet, by the end of the movie, we know that there are donkey dragon babies flying about. Or consider the movie Star Wars. Virtually every character in there had a similar reaction formation dynamic with another character. Luke and Hans, Luke and Leia. Leia and Luke, Leia and Hans, and so on. C-3PO to R2-D2. Luke to his father, and his father to Luke. So virtually every character had a reaction formation dynamic, changing one emotion into an intensely strong, different emotion. Denial is the same in any context in life. Something too big, too bad, you flat out refuse to accept the possibility. Think of some examples of denial. Somebody denying that a loved one has just died. Somebody denying that they've been cheated on. Somebody denying to themselves that they've been fired. Maybe you share with somebody you've been fired and they say, no, you're joking, you're kidding. They are in denial for you. Perhaps that somebody has a substance abuse problem, and so on. So flat out refusing to accept the possibility until you realize that it is indeed true. One student sadly shared with me that you're going bald, because apparently he had recently moved out of denying the fact that even though he was a young man, he was in fact going bald. In displacement, an emotion is displaced from one person or thing to another person or thing. In other words, transferred. So maybe you've had a terrible day at work or school, and you realize it would be unwise to vent your frustrations on your boss or your teacher. So maybe you are very difficult to the person in the checkout line that's doing the cashier job, who might have had their own bad day. Or you give lip to the officer that pulled you over. Bad idea. Or you're home and you're very unpleasant to your dogs, your partner, your children. So all examples of displacement. Many fights over things like such as toothpaste caps and which way the paper towels hang are really displaced anger over much bigger issues. In rationalization, you offer an excuse for something that you've done, but it's essential that you actually believe the excuse. So you're not lying. You believe what you're saying, but what you're saying is truly not what's going on. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you are married and you just missed your 5th-year wedding anniversary. Your spouse is incredibly angry, and you say, I'm so sorry I missed it, but I've been so busy now between normal school and work, and now the coronavirus, and the kids have been sick. I've been overwhelmed. You know I love you. As soon as this is all over, we'll go out to your finest restaurant. And you believe everything that you say, but maybe in reality, you deeply regret marrying this person. You deeply regret 5 years of your youth that are gone forever. Maybe you regret that your 2 children not only look exactly like your spouse, but are now acting with every day more and more like your spouse. So since this is too much for you to withstand, You say, I'm sorry, I've been overwhelmed lately. I forgot, I love you. Well, that is a big rationalization. I made that up when I was married, by the way. Study the definitions of the defense mechanisms on the previous page. When you're comfortable, do this activity, match the term with the example on the right side. No cheating, you'll actually get a lot more out of this if you actually do it. Next, saying I forgot it and actually meaning it, but deep down you'd rather do anything else. Well, you have just rationalized. Next one, you had the rough start in life, have no memories of before that age. Apparently you have fully repressed them. They still might come back bit by bit, dribs and drabs throughout your life. Movies that the characters have one strong emotion, change it into a very different strong emotion. That's Hallmark reaction formation. Next one, you have a fight with your housemate, so you take your anger out on some innocent party. You have just displaced your anger. And last one, Dan here. It sounds like Dan is having some issues and having difficulty dealing with what's going on in that particular stage of his life. It sounds like Dan is now in the process of regressing. Take a moment and see if you can fill in the blanks. I'll pause here. So how many stages and what are the specific stage names for Freud, in other words? Well, hopefully you know 5 or counted 5. The stages, you might be inclined to say psychoanalysis, but no, that's Freud's therapy. You might be inclined to say psychodynamic or analytic. No, that would be his general theory. You might say psychosocial. No, that would be another Freud-related person. Hopefully you were thinking, or now are thinking, psychosexual. So 5 stages: oral, anal, phallic, lancing, genital. And underneath the covering of the thing, birth to 2, 2 to 5 or 6, 5 or 6 until puberty, and puberty afterwards forevermore as long as you live. In Introduction to Psychology, when I cover Freud's psychosexual stages, I put in a lot of detail, but this is not a intro course or a personality course. So my basic expectation is that you'll be able to order these stages, and perhaps just as a basic, I might ask you which stage had the Oedipus or electric complex. But on top of that, let's bring this around specifically to our course. We noted that lifelong development is a basic of the field. We see development as lifelong. Within that perspective, there is a question: is it continuous or is it discontinuous? One of those two terms reflects a stage orientation, whereas the other term reflects a non-stage orientation. We can see right here that Freud clearly has stages. So my question to you is it a continuous or discontinuous perspective theory? Think on that as well as the Oedipus and electric complex question, and then you can click the next icon, which will hopefully match what you thought. So the stage with the Oedipus and electric complex, when little boys often announce that they want to marry mommy, or little girls glow with daddy's attention, that would be the stage of the Oedipus complex. So hopefully the Oedipus complex, and hopefully you know that in the electric complex, would be in the phallic stage. In terms of, is this a lifespan theory that has a continuous or discontinuous perspective? Well, hopefully you remember that discontinuous means discrete breaks, clear breaks, i.e. stages. So clearly this theory does not look at continuous development. It sees distinct stages, distinct breaks. So this would be a theory with a discontinuous perspective. one last important detail before we leave this slide. Within the lifespan, lifelong perspective, some theorists see some stages as being more important, more foundational. Freud would be one of these theorists. He sees the bulk of personality formed no later than the phallic stage. So the first three stages, oral, anal, phallic, would be foundational for personality and who we are in life. His student, that we'll discuss next, Erik Erikson, didn't prioritize any stage over another. Let's consider Neo-Freudian Erik Erikson for a moment. There are other famous Neo-Freudians, Karen Horney, Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, Harry Stack Sullivan, which comes from the hills from outside my little town in Norwich, New York. But focusing on Erik Erikson, as you can see from this slide, he is associated with not sexual, but specifically psychosocial development. He has, as you can see, 8 stages, focusing on psychosocial development. Each stage has a positive outcome versus a bad positive outcome. And so each stage, the person may or may not successfully resolve it. Perhaps they can resolve it successfully in the future. If they don't, then. So whereas Freud had an emphasis on the first 5 years of life in terms of impact on the rest of the life, Erikson really doesn't emphasize any stage over the other one. So now that you've hopefully tried the fill in the blanks in your own, let's see how you did. So Erikson's, it's asking for a number here, number would be 8, psycho, and you might think psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, because Erikson is a student of Freud, but this is specific to Erikson, so is 8 psychosocial stages. Now in terms of each stage, first one's easy, basic trust versus mistrust. Now it gets harder. Autonomy, in other words, doing things on your own versus shame and doubt. Use the toilet training as an image here. Can they do it? It's tough in the beginning. We don't remember, but it was probably quite tough. Initiative, doing new activities versus maybe guilt over trying them or failing at them. Industry, now you're in the school years, doing new projects, trying new things, all sorts of things. Industry versus inferiority, maybe failing or fear failing at the task. Identity, working on your identity. You'll learn about Marcia in future, the main identity theorist, versus role confusion. Intimacy versus isolation. Generativity, people who get to retirement years often want to give back to society. So generativity versus stagnation. And the last one, integrity, the late adulthood, all the losses of people, physical ability, control over your life, and so on. So integrity versus and impending death, integrity versus despair. So perhaps do the slide occasionally and to make sure you learn it, and maybe even make a master list of slides that are particularly difficult, because this is probably a difficult slide. So if you've already done your textbook, see if you can match the first term with the corresponding second term of these 8 stages. Perhaps alternatively you cover them in intro psych. Now my students, I just do the first stage as well as the stage of adolescence and early adulthood, since most of my students are either in adolescence or early adulthood. So either based on your reading, or if you prefer to make educated guesses, see what you believe goes in each blank and then jot down, and then see how you do it in the next listening icon. So please actually do it if you will. You'll get more out of it. So some of these 8 stages are easily guessable using the choices below. Others, not so much. So let's take a look. Basic trust versus mistrust. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. Initiative versus guilt. Industry versus inferiority. Now for the stages that you're most likely to be in: identity versus role confusion, early adulthood intimacy versus isolation, middle adulthood generativity versus stagnation, and lastly, integrity versus despair. How'd you do? And one last point before we move on. In an earlier slide, we know that Freud emphasized our early years as being more important to personality and who we are in life. So a reasonable question would be did his student Erickson believe that the early years were standout and foundational and key and more important? And the answer is no. He equally emphasized the different stages. Since all our 200 psych courses assume that you've learned some basic concepts in intro psych, this slide is just designed to test what you remember. So go back to your learning chapter in your memory from intro psych and see if you can remember these four major learning theories. What approach were they associated with? The next slide will help you to shore up your memory and knowledge if need be. So let's review basic learning content. Now the first term we're going to discuss primarily in the future, but just as a short review, no names associated with it. Habituation, just learning to ignore unchanging stimuli. In intro psych, I give the example, if you move an apartment next to a railroad track, initially the sounds might grab your attention and be disconcerting. Soon you'll probably learn to totally ignore them. That's a type of learning to ignore. And we'll tie this into studies of infant learning in the future. But let's get to the three types of learning that were going to be central right now in this chapter. Social learning, when a model is observed and then imitated. Could be for better, could be for worse. You might remember the Bobo-Doll experiments from intro psych. And that would be Albert Bandura, the gentleman in the third from the left. Classical conditioning. Hopefully you remember Ivan Pavlov, the Russian Nobel laureate, shown on the far left. His famous experiments with conditioning the salivation response in dogs. Also, the next slide, John B. Watson of Little Albert fame, his work focused primarily on classical conditioning. Then we have operant conditioning, also known as instrumental conditioning. Its major theorists, one B.F. Skinner, who worked primarily with pigeons and rats. He preferred pigeons. I assume we would too if we had the choice between the two species. He also wrote a book on the application of those principles to humans. And with that, let's move on. Before we move on, I should also test your memory. Which approach was reinforcement and punishment central to? Again, hopefully you remember reinforcement used to strengthen behaviors, punishments of all types given to weaken behaviors. So which one of these four learnings? Take a moment and consider. Hopefully you will go with instrumental conditioning. In intro psych, I tie instrumental conditioning as a definition, behavior strengthened or weakened to what happens afterwards. In other words, reinforcers or punishers. So let's see how you did on this review activity. Ivan Pavlov, he'd be the second from the left in the black jacket. Albert Bandura would be the more modern picture. He just died in 2021, far right. B.F. Skinner with his pigeons. And John B. Watson with the humorous, somewhat humorous side saying, I don't always scare babies, but when I do, it's in the name of psychology. Now, in terms of the type of learning, social learning, Albert Bandura, classical conditioning, Ivan Pavlov, but also John B. Watson, operant conditioning, B.F. Skinner, instrumental conditioning, well, same thing, so B.F. Skinner, Pavlovian conditioning, named after the discoverer of classical conditioning, Ivan Pavlov, but since John B. Watson did classical conditioning slash Pavlovian conditioning studies, also associate with him too. Learning by imitation, the famous Bobo doll experiment by Bandura. In terms of definition, learning through reinforcement and punishment, that is at the heart of operant slash instrumental conditioning. Learning through reflexes, pairing the basically the US and CS, remember the unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus. Hopefully that doesn't bring back nightmares of intro psych. That would be the Pavlovian slash classical conditioning. And learning by watching a model imitating, such as in the famous Bobo doll experiments. And if you need to do that a few times, don't be afraid to. This slide builds on the other slide. So in this one, you're asked to identify the individuals, as well as additional information. So when discussing our basic principles of development, we know that we unanimously agree development is lifelong. But within that, there is a question, is it continuous or discontinuous? And again, as I'm sure you know by now, discontinuous, stage theory oriented, continuous flow, no stages. We learned that the psychodynamic people definitely proposed stages, so I assume you know what that means. But with the great learning theorists, did we have any stages? No. So would that place them in the continuous or discontinuous camp? This, I want you to, probably an easy answer, but if not, go back and think about it and look at that slide on continuous and discontinuous. So time to leave the learning theorist and learning approach for now and consider Jean Piaget, our Swiss theorist. We learned that some individuals, including your teacher, consider him to be the father of developmental psychology. But in any case, we know he is the great pioneer in the study of children's thinking, children's cognition. So consider him to be a developmental cognitive psychologist at the very least. In intro psych, you probably learned his 4 stages and the major events thereof. So see if you can pull up those memories. What are those 4 stages in any order? Piaget, in his view of children's maturation, stressed biological determinism, meaning the brain was in charge of when the child was able to acquire certain abilities, to move from stage to stage. It was biologically determined. But that being said, he also recognized that children will actively take an active role in their learning process and actively construct their knowledge of the world. Later on, we'll learn about 2 processes called assimilation and accommodation. So for now, associated with Piaget with these stages, a stress of biological determinism, and 2 processes that we'll learn about later, assimilation and accommodation. Based on what you learned in intro psych, or what you've learned more recently by reading your textbook, please order the following stages of Piaget. An alternate theory to Piaget's cognitive theory is information processing theory. This theory, unlike almost all the other theories discussed, is not associated with any one particular individual, and its focus, information processing, You probably covered an intro psych in the memory chapter. Please look at the diagram below for a brief review. Did you consider the question at the bottom of the page? Hopefully you weren't suffering TOT, which stands for tip of the tongue. It's asking you to name working memory. Let's examine the principle and context from both these in a little bit more detail. There are three systems of contextual influences. They have no particular order, but let's start with the normative age-graded events, then we'll consider non-normative events, and then normative history-graded events. For the first one, the normative age-graded events, they're things that happen to many individuals of a given culture at a certain age, hence the age-graded. It can be related to a biological event, or it can be something that's typically undertaken at that culture at a particular time. So, for example, going to kindergarten at age 5. Maybe a girl's first menstruation around age 11 or 12, though sometimes sooner, sometimes later, but those would be two good examples. Non-normative events that we wouldn't necessarily experience or expect to experience. So it could be having one's college shut down. It could be a parent losing a job, or a parent being deployed overseas. It could be being diagnosed with cancer at a young age. Normative history-grade events are historical events that impact a generation. For example, you have probably participated in active shooter drills. When I was in elementary school, we would do duck and cover under the desk in case of a nuclear attack. So normative history grade. Think of people growing up in the Great Depression. Nothing was thrown away. We're losing this generation right now on rapid numbers. My father's part of this generation. Perhaps people that grew up when cars were introduced, maybe people who grew up when internet was first introduced, people who grew up, or people of a certain age when cell phones. So this is impacting people of a given culture in a particular niche in history. If you're comfortable with this, go and consider the 4 examples on the bottom and identify them. So being held back or skipping a grade, both not typical events, that would be non-normative. Most children staying between 10 months and 12 months, that would be a normative age-graded event. Losing a parent as a child or a teen, thank goodness, non-normative. And today's children participating in active shooter drills, a normative history graded event. Let's now consider the ecological theory proposed by Urie Bronfenbrenner. At the first level, we have the microsystem. These are, maybe we'll say the word agents, that can directly impact and interact with the child. So who are the important people in a child's life? Obviously parents, siblings, or foster parents, perhaps grandparents or extended family, maybe the soccer coach, maybe the speech therapist if a child needs one, and so on. The mesosystem are the interaction between the microsystems, maybe the parent's interaction with the teacher, the parent's interaction with the speech pathologist, a soccer coach that they love or find that doesn't favor their child and doesn't use their child properly, and so on. Next, we have exosystem. These are the institutions that impact the child. Take a moment and think of what institutions. You're probably thinking perhaps school or educational institutions, obviously. How about medical institutions? The child that does versus does not get medical care. Perhaps political systems in which money is forwarded to certain school systems that benefit the child or not, and so on. Mass media, parental jobs, the list is endless. Next, we'll consider the macro system. The cultural values and beliefs. Obviously, this would change from generation to generation. Next, the chronosystem, chrono-like and chronological, the time period, the historical context. People that grew up in the Roaring '20s, as they were called, versus the Great Depression of the 1930s. The war years of the 1940s, the baby booming time period of the 1950s, also the time where civil rights was just about ready to, be launched. 60s, anti-Vietnam, women's liberation, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in terms of civil rights and so on. Perhaps increased LGBT rights from the mid 2000s and to now, obviously, and so on. So the historical context that will impact the individuals living in that time period.